Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and well, these are the 10 most hyped budget IEMs of 2022. So looking back on the year, I realized I haven't reviewed a ton of budget picks, and I'm always getting questions about the latest budget stuff. It seems like there is a new hype train every month, or maybe even sometimes more than once a month. And I thought, I wanted to catch up on the hype and see where things are at, and what better way to do that than with a bracket tournament. That's right. I've got set up here a bracket tournament with all 10 of these competitors, all IEMs that came out in 2022, all under 40 bucks. And we're going to find out what is the best, once and for all, what is the best budget IEM to get, at least for now, because obviously these things change. But yeah, I thought this would be a fun way for me to catch up on just a bunch of budget picks that I kind of haven't been paying a whole lot of attention to. So I've got them here now. I've spent some time listening to them, and like I showed, I've got them set up in a bracket style tournament. This is a double elimination tournament. There are 18 individual matchups. We're going to go through them one by one. I'll explain which one I think wins the matchup. That will advance to the next place in the bracket. If you're not familiar with bracket tournaments, well, here's going to be a little bit of a crash course. I love watching Street Fighter tournaments, so that's kind of my inspiration over here. I don't know if there's much more to say. I guess before we get into the actual bracket tournament, we'll just give a little bit of an overview of our 10 competitors that we've got here. And I'll go through them in alphabetical order because that's the only order that's fair. And we'll start up here with the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero. Pretty much, yeah, absolutely all of these are single dynamic driver earphones, including the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero. But the prices are different. This one is coming in at 23 bucks, and this is an IEM that was recently revealed to have been a tuning collaboration between Critical and 7 Hz. So that's definitely going to be a strong contender heading into this. Another IEM, another competitor here is the Kiwi Ears Cadenza. This is one that just came out pretty recently, actually. It's at 35 bucks, also, again, a single dynamic driver earphone, and this is from the same brand that brought us the Kiwi Ears Orchestra. It was like a $500 earphone, and their second IEM ever is this $35 budget pick. Has a lot of hype coming in the past month or so, so definitely was interested to see how that one stacks up. Of course, over here we've got the Moondrop Chu. This is one of the earliest budget hype monsters, hype beasts of the year. This one's 20 bucks, and this was sent in to me via Shenzhen Audio. I don't know. This one doesn't really need much of an introduction. You've probably seen me review this one. This is one of the few budget IEMs I did review this year. But that's not the only Moondrop IEM we've got, because we've also got over here the Moondrop Quarks DSP version, okay? This is a $15 IEM sent in via Hifi Go, and well, you might remember the Quarks from last year, actually. The DSP version, what's different about this is it uses a USB-C connector instead of a 3.5 millimeter. And that means that there is a DAC chip built in here, and that DAC chip has EQ built into it. DSP stands for digital signal processing, so basically the tuning of this set is pretty unique for what you would normally expect for a single dynamic driver set. Also, what we've got over here is the Tanchjim, well, let's start here, the Tanchjim Ola. This is one that I also did review. This was sent in by Shenzhen Audio for 40 bucks. Yeah, this is one of the earlier budget picks to have come out this year. But there is also another budget pick from Tanchjim, also sent in via Shenzhen Audio. This is actually quite a bit cheaper. The Zero is only 20 bucks. And again, it's also a single dynamic driver set. Again, we're gonna get into how these things sound and compare in a little bit, but just going through the overview, we're almost done. Let's move over to, let's take a look at this one. This is the Tangzu Wan'er, I believe is how I'm supposed to be saying that. This is also 20 bucks, also single dynamic driver, and this is one of the latest batches of hype trains coming out here. I feel like it's been the Tanchjim, the Kiwi Ears, and the QKZ, which I guess we'll talk about next. This is the QKZ Cross HBB, also 20 bucks, also single dynamic driver. And as the name implies, this is another tuning collab with fellow reviewer Chris from Bad Guy Good Audio Reviews. Again, coming at 20 bucks. And then the last two that I'll talk about jumped out of alphabetical order there for a second, but this one is the Tripowin Lea. This one actually came in really early in the year, and I think pretty kind of flew under the radar, but I bought this one for myself for 26 bucks because I thought the frequency response graph that I had seen on Critical site was pretty impressive and I was interested to check it out. So we will talk about how that compares. And then finally, we've got the Tin Hi-Fi C2. This one, I believe, came out pretty recently. This one's 30 bucks. And what's interesting about the C2 is that this came out with a couple of other Tin Hi-Fi IEMs at around the same time. There's the C3 and then the T4 Plus. And to be honest, this is the cheapest of those three, and it's actually the one that I like the best of those three new Tin Hi-Fi IEMs. But how does it stack up against the rest of these? Well, that's what we're going to find out here as we do some KONCHA KOMBAT. So like I mentioned, we're going to go through this bracket one by one, go through each matchup, and basically the way this works, let's see if I can get my mouse to work. Basically what we're going to do is I'm going to do a little comparison between the Tin Hi-Fi C2 versus the Tanchjim Zero. The winner of this comparison is going to move on to face the Tangzu Wan'er, and that's going to face the winner of the Kiwi Ears Cadenza and Tripowin Lea, and it's going to whittle itself down to, finally we will have an overall winner of an IEM. Down here we've actually got a loser's bracket. This is a double elimination tournament, and the main goal of having this double elimination tournament just means we're going to have a better resolution on the ranking, okay? Rather than if we were just to do this single elimination, there would be a bunch of IEMs tied. Breaking them out into a double elimination tournament will give us a little bit more stratification in terms of how they stack up and compare. And so I think with that out of the way, let's dive into our first comparison, the Tin Hi-Fi C2 versus the Tanchjim Zero. And let me go ahead and move these other IEMs out of the way so we can focus on and talk about these two IEMs. And these are our first competitors in KONCHA KOMBAT. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to rank them. I'm going to kind of give them scores, all right? Basically based on tonal balance, technicalities, and then form factor, because the physical stuff matters a lot to me. I think it matters a lot to a lot of people, to be honest. And I'll also say that these comparisons will probably be a little bit more wordy up front as I describe each IEM individually, but then as we get further in the tournament, I feel like these little matchups are going to go a little bit quicker. But let's start here with the Tanchjim Zero, and I guess I can punch in on that while we're talking about it. I would say that tonality here on the Tanchjim Zero is quite bright. This is definitely a vocal focus set. And honestly, the tuning on this, I would say, is a little bit skewed. It reminds me a lot of the Moondrop SSR, to be honest. But what's interesting is that even though this is definitely not a bass forward IEM, the bass does actually hit surprisingly hard. The benefit of having that bright tuning is that the Tanchjim Zero just has pretty exaggerated imaging, probably the strongest sense of separation and distinct positioning of all the IEMs here on the table. And yeah, I mean, that's what it's got going for it. I think though that the tonality on this is definitely in the skewed area. I mentioned that comparison versus the SSR. I do think this sounds like a lower resolution version of the SSR. On one of my test tracks, Break for Lovers, I felt like the tonality in this just kind of sounded like that's a good song for me to figure out the tonality, and just kind of immediately it sounded a little bit wrong here on the Tanchjim Zero. On another test track I like to use called Games of Luck by the Parcels, the hi-hats were a little bit on the plasticky side. I think the upper treble on this set is, I don't know, it's not the most filled out. Again, it's a budget set, it's 20 bucks. I think it's performing pretty well for its price range, but in this competition, we're not looking for pretty well in its price range. We're looking for the best. The one thing I will say about this is I do actually kind of like the form factor. Now, this is one of the few IEMs on the table that does not have a replaceable cable. So you are stuck with this cable, but the stock cable that it has is actually a really nice lightweight cable, very SSR-like. It is not memory prone. Pretty into this cable. So the form factor is pretty good. I would say fit security, however, is only so-so. So that is how this one stacks up. Now let's talk about the Tin Hi-Fi C2. And let me pull up my notes real quick. Honestly, the tuning on this I would describe as more of a mild V-shaped sound signature. There's a little bit of a bass emphasis, a little bit of a lower treble emphasis. But surprisingly, the tonality on the set is really just quite smooth, and it has good extension both in the bottom and the top. The bass digs pretty nice and deep, and the upper treble especially is pretty impressive, to be honest, especially for a budget set. But I mean, even, yeah, without that caveat, the upper treble on this set is actually legitimately quite good. That contributes to, I think, a good sense of imaging, maybe not quite as exaggerated as something like the Tanchjim Zero over here, but still very, very good sense of imaging. And also because it's got that nice bass with that sub bass, it's got a nice sense of depth kind of front to back. So yeah, I don't know, this is honestly a pretty impressive set. Again, with my test track Break for Lovers, the Tin Hi-Fi C2, honestly, it sounded kind of pretty awesome. There's like these little treble ticks in the beginning that sound really nice and incisive and not at all harsh. With that same track that I talked about before, the Parcels, their Games of Luck track, it's got these hi-hats that actually sound great. Like the timbre on them was really good, and hi-hats tend to be a good test of how well the treble is tuned, especially like the upper treble. And then even with my sibilance test track, which is a Church's Graffiti, I feel like the C2 actually did a pretty stinking good job. So if we go back over here to our bracket, in terms of tonal balance, I think the C2 is going to take the point there. In terms of technical performance, I mean, the Tanchjim Zero does have pretty nice imaging chops, but overall, I mean, I think the C2 is pretty far ahead in terms of resolution and depth of that sound field. And then when it comes to the form factor, I didn't really talk too much about it, but these are an all metal shell, which is really pretty impressive. Again, at 30 bucks. That's pretty surprising they've got this nice build. The cable is not the best cable, but it's also not the worst. And so, you know, honestly, I'll still take the build over the Tanchjim Zero because it is that metal shell. And so overall, I think the Tin Hi-Fi C2 is going to take this one, if I'm honest, pretty easily. So let's go ahead and submit that score. You see that the C2 is going to move up over here to the Tangzu Wan'er, but we're not going to do that matchup just yet. We'll do that one in a bit. Let's go down instead here and let's talk about how the Tanchjim Ola and the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero compare. So let's move that to the side. That's right, we're talking about another Tanchjim IEM. This is the Ola and the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero, which we talked about as being revealed as kind of a secret critical tuning collab. All right, let's see. I'll pull up my notes real quick so I don't miss anything. We'll start with the Tanchjim Ola, and we'll punch in on that because we can. Tuning on this is also pretty unique on the table. A lot of these IEMs have kind of a mild V-shaped sound signature, but the Tanchjim stuff is the exception here. This I would describe as just kind of like a low contrast, mid-range focused, mostly neutral sound signature here on the Tanchjim Ola. The bass on this set is unfortunately, I think, the biggest weak spot. It is just dead, and it rolls off pretty obviously in a graph. And as I was testing it, I was surprised at how obvious it rolls off to the ear as well. Part of that comes because the fit on this set is just weird. Like I don't get a seal like 50% of the time that I fit this thing, and I'm not sure what that's about. You know, I like the way this thing looks. It's got, again, a nice cable, and this one does have removable 2-pin connectors, but if I'm perfectly honest, I don't love the Tanchjim Ola. It's an okay set. It's got like a decent tonality. It's just overall though, because of that dead bass, it's got somewhat weak glaring. It sounds a little bit two-dimensional, especially versus a bunch of the others on here. It is good with things like guitar pulls. Like I was listening to another test track I like to use is called Suffer by the Smashing Pumpkins, and I felt like the guitar pulls on that added a sense of depth that this thing was otherwise missing. But if you're not listening to music that has those guitar pulls, or maybe like trumpets or something like that, and that like, you know, upper mid-range, lower treble region, there's a little bit of emphasis here, and that can kind of add to a sense of space. But in the absence of those, this sounds a little bit on the flat side. And then again, on my test track Games of Luck by the Parcels, I thought the hi-hats actually sounded pretty awesome. But when, well, I don't want to say awesome, they sound pretty solid. But when the kick drum comes in, it's because of that dead bass. Like it just sounded like there was nothing behind the bass. Versus the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero. Let's talk about how this one compares. And to be honest, like I mentioned, this one's revealed as somewhat of a tuning collaboration with Critical. So as you might expect, the tuning on the set is Very, very good. In fact, for 20 bucks or 23 bucks, whatever the price is, I think the tuning on this set is pretty outstanding. Tonality is just right. The bass is maybe a little bit light in competition with some of these other IEMs, not versus the Ola. It's got better bass than the Ola for sure, but this is not going to be the bassiest of the bunch. It's kind of a tuned or a laid back bass presence, but what bass is there is actually pretty good. Vocals, what I think are part of what really stands out here on the Salnotes Zero, they have just a surprisingly decent sense of micro contrast. They're well textured, and surprisingly a good sense of resolution for a budget set. Again, on my test track, Break for Lovers, the tonality on the set, again, that's one of those songs I use for tonal checks, just came across immediately as awesome. The vocals just come through nice and easy. And again, because it's a little bit less of a V-shaped sound signature versus some of these others, it just really pulls out that vocal performance. On Games of Luck, the parcel song with the hi-hats, they have a nice sense of timbre to them. They actually sound like metallic things being hit, and that's somewhat rare in, I don't know, any dynamic driver space, but especially here in the budget space. I will say that my test track Graffiti with Churches was a little bit on the sibilant side, but it wasn't too bad. And look, that song is a sibilant recording, so that's kind of meant to bring it out. And then my final note on songs is another track I like to use is called K by Cigarettes After Sex. And I would say that the bass line on this set sounded maybe a little bit in the background, but again, that's just because this is not an overly bass forward set. The tonality here, it led to a really good vocal performance, just nice ease and a good sense of texture. So if we go back to our bracket, how these things compare, again, I don't think this is honestly going to be very, very close. In terms of tonal performance or tonal, we're going to give the win to the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero. In terms of technical performance, I'm also going to give the win to the Salnotes Zero. And then in terms of build and form factor, that's actually a little bit of a difficult one because I think the Ola is a pretty handsome looking set, but it just fits me like garbage. The 7 Hz Salnotes Zero is a goofy looking set. I bought this particularly. Actually, Linsol sent me a version, and I bought a second one on purpose in this awful colorway because it looks silly. But this is just not the best looking IEM. But fit is surprisingly pretty solid. So I'm actually going to have to give, again, kind of a clean sweep win to the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero. So 7 Hz Salnotes Zero will advance in the bracket, and now we're left with a new set of comparisons that we can make. And then you can see down here the two Tanchjims are taking up their spot in the losers bracket. They'll get a couple of competitors in a little bit. But let's start with some more comparisons. I'm actually going to skip this one for now. And you know what? Let's do it now. Let's just peel the Band-Aid off. Let's talk about how the Tin Hi-Fi C2, which just won its first match, is going to compare with the Tangzu Wan'er, all right? Which is one of the more recent budget hype trains. Let me pull up my notes on the Wan'er real quick. And again, we already talked about the C2, so I don't need to talk too much about it. But the Wan'er here, I would say it actually has a pretty aggressive bass attack, and I think that's probably contributing to a lot of why this IEM has such a bit of hype behind it, is it does have this really just aggressive bass attack. And if you're looking for that, the set does that. I will say, I think that there is a little bit of kind of like a hollow echo sound to the bass, so I don't know that I love the bass here. You know, it does hit hard, and it's not bloaty or smeary. It just has a bit of a plasticky-ness to just the follow-through. It's more like the bass attack is pretty good, but it's more the decay that comes across a little bit artificial. And then up top, I think kind of similarly in the treble region, this can sound a little bit artificial, a little bit shrill. The treble is somewhat on the sharp side, not overly, again, people are hyping this, so obviously it's not super offensive, but in comparison with some other IEMs, I do find it a little bit sharp, a little bit clacky, and frankly, a little bit harsh. And because of that emphasis in the treble and the emphasis in the bass, I do find that the mid-range gets a little bit lost on this. So this I would describe as, again, a V-shaped sound signature, probably a little bit more V-shaped than something like the Tin Hi-Fi C2. On my test track, Break for Lovers, I felt that the treble was honestly a little bit kind of rough on that set. That song has, it starts with like these bass hits and this like treble ch ch ch, and that's just kind of an immediate red flag for a set that doesn't do treble well, is that sound and how well a set can reproduce it. And unfortunately here with the Tangzu Wan'er, I wasn't super impressed with it. It wasn't awful, but again, it wasn't great. Frankly, I thought that the tonality in the set was a little bit weaker than the graph would suggest. On Games of Luck, again, the parcels track where I usually do kind of a hi-hat test. The hi-hats actually didn't sound too bad, but unfortunately there was a little bit of sibilance in the vocal, and obviously going to my real sibilance stress test graffiti by churches, unfortunately the Tangzu Wan'er I found was pretty sibilant. So we already again talked about my comparisons here with, or we already talked about the C2, so let's talk about this little head-to-head. All right. In terms of tonal balance, honestly, I'm going to give the win to the C2. I think the more mild V-shaped sound signature, it gives me a better mid-range presentation, which personally I appreciate. And in terms of technical performance, I mean, if you really want that aggressive bass attack, the Wan'er does that. But again, I felt like the decay in the bass is kind of unnatural sounding, and the Tin Hi-Fi C2 bass is actually really good. It's nice and tight and punchy with a satisfying decay to it. And then the treble was just, I think, leagues better on the C2. So again, in the technical performance, I'm going to give the C2 the win. And then in terms of physical stuff, I didn't talk too much about the Wan'er. I think it looks pretty nice here from the outside, but unfortunately on the inside, it is just kind of like a thin, cheap plastic shell. This looks to me like something you might get out of a gumball machine or something like that. I don't know. It fits fine, but I don't think it really stands up to the metal build. Now, the C2 is 50% more expensive. This is 20 bucks versus 30 bucks, but in KONCHA KOMBAT here, that doesn't matter. So I think the C2 is honestly going to take another clean sweep. And I don't know, that might disappoint some folks because again, I know the Tangzu Wan'er has a bit of hype behind it right now, but I'm not super impressed with it. I think it's a decent set, but I'm not super impressed with it. So that's going to go, we're going to send the Tangzu Wan'er down to the losers bracket, and the C2 is going to advance. And then I think once, we'll give these things actually overall scores as they exit the tournament, so to speak. But we can move on to our next matchup here. We've got the Kiwi Ears Cadenza and the Tripowin Lea. Again, kind of a reminder about the Kiwi Ears. This is, I believe, their second ever IEM. And they started with an expensive IEM and then came out with a budget set. And here we've got the Tripowin Lea, which came out earlier this year. Let's get through how these things just broadly stack up. All right, so the Tripowin Lea, again, I mentioned I bought this because I thought the frequency response was actually pretty impressive. Unfortunately, when it comes to listening to it, it's not bad. The tuning is actually pretty decent on this set, but vocals do come across a little bit thin and surprisingly a little bit distant. The bass is pretty decently tight, however, but it's just the treble, I would say, here on the Tripowin Lea sounds a little bit low res, a little bit grainy, not so much harsh, right? And not so much sharp in the way that some of these other budget IEMs can sound in the treble. It just sounds a little bit grainy and a little bit low resolution. Overall, it's a pretty listenable set. Again, kind of a mild V-shaped sound signature, a little bit on the brighter end. But that's the Lea. With Break for Lovers, I thought, again, the vocals sound a little bit thinned out, overall smooth, and again, pretty nice bass. And then with my test track, Games of Luck, the hi-hats sounded a little bit metallic, which I guess you would probably want from a hi-hat, but there was also kind of like a sandy undercurrent, and I contribute that to the, again, somewhat grainy sounding low-res treble here on the Tripowin Lea. And then I guess a quick punch in on this for the physical stuff. This is an all metal build, only 26 bucks, which is pretty good. The cable's a little bit memory prone, but I don't know, not too bad of a physical form factor. But then finally, let's move over here to the Kiwi Ears Cadenza. And, well, again, let me pull up my notes on this so I don't miss anything. But tuning wise, I would say this is pretty similar to the rest of the bunch in that it is a mild V shape. I would say though, of the bunch, it's maybe a little bit more mid-range focus. The treble on this rolls off the most, I think. You can see that as much in a frequency response graph. And when it comes to the listening experience, I think what that contributes to is just kind of a little bit of a sense of dryness up there. The bass attack on this, however, I would say is pretty firm, but kind of similar to the Tangzu Wan'er. It can come across a little bit hollow. I think the effect is not nearly as bad here on the Kiwi ears as it is in the Tangzu, but it is there a little bit. But yeah, just generally just kind of a nice, more mid-range focused, mild V-shape sound signature. Just happens to be a little bit dry up top would be my one quibble with the sound in this. So again, my test track, Break for Lovers, vocal tone, and even like the 3D positioning are actually pretty fantastic here on the set. Unfortunately, that little treble ch that I mentioned, it doesn't come across harsh or like sharp or anything like that. It's not irritating. It just comes across a little bit dead sounding, which I know is not the most elaborate explanation, but if you listen to it, you'll probably agree with me. On the test track K by Cigarettes After Sec, the bass line was very, very present here on this set, so there is a hefty amount of bass emphasis on here. Maybe a little bit overemphasized, but not distracting. It's just, if you're looking for bass, the Kiwi ears is actually doing it pretty well. And then Games of Luck, I thought the hi-hats on that sound, that's kind of where that dryness and the treble can come across. The hi-hats just sound a little bit dry and plasticky. And then with my sibilance test, Graffiti, I did find that the Kiwi ears was a little bit sibilant, but not awful. So in this comparison between the Kiwi ears and the Tripowin Lea, in terms of tone, honestly, they're both pretty good. I'm going to give them both a point for the tone. Technical performance, however, I am going to give the edge to the Cadenza. I think it does a better sense of depth. And while the treble can come across maybe a little bit dry sounding, it doesn't have that sense of graininess and low resolution that the Lea does. And then in terms of form factor, they're both pretty good. You get the metal build on the Lea, but I think I like the look and the aesthetic on these plastic shells. This is the Kiwi ears. This actually fits really pretty well, and the cable in this is actually also surprisingly nice. So I will also give a point to the Kiwi ears Cadenza, which means that the Kiwi ears Cadenza moves on in the winners bracket, and the Tripowin Lea is knocked down here into our losers bracket. But that's going to move us on to our next matchup of the day, which is the QKZ. Let's move these things out of the way real quick. The QK, where have I got these things? Okay, I've got too many IEMs on my table. QKZ Cross HBB versus the Moondrop Quarks DSP edition specifically. All right. This is a kind of an interesting comparison because, well, the Quarks is just a little bit more different than some of the others. Again, here with the QKZ Cross HBB, you've got somewhat of a V-shaped sound signature and probably a little bit more on the bassy, warm side versus some of these others. In fact, I would say this is a pretty V-shaped sound signature. And okay, it doesn't kind of have a little bit more bass. This is by far the bassiest of the bunch. If you want the bassiest set on this table, the bassiest budget IEM of 2022, well, the QKZ Cross HBB is it. Unfortunately, I find the bass honestly pretty woofy. I don't think it's especially good bass. And because of that bass emphasis, it pushes the mid-range to the back. The mid-range is, you know, like vocals specifically, they are more or less tonally correct, actually. They're just pretty far behind in the mix behind that bass. And then unfortunately, the treble is where I think that the QKZ Cross HBB is probably at its weakest. It's just kind of low resolution sounding. It's interesting because looking at it on a graph, it extends pretty well. It feels like it should be pretty good, but I feel like the listening experience was not ideal for me. Again, my test track, Break for Lovers, I felt like the bass hits on Break for Lovers, which are right in the beginning of this track, are frankly just kind of undefined because I think the bass on this is just, it's pretty loose and woofy, and the vocals sound a little bit distant, and then the treble just sounds a little bit smudged and frankly kind of low res. That would be my thoughts here on the QKZ. In terms of form factor and stuff, look, I think it's a pretty nice looking IEM. It looks a lot like a KZ build. In fact, I'm surprised this is not a KZ build because it looks exactly like it's even using a KZ KZ-ish cable, if that's not exactly a KZ cable. Decent little cable, decent little IEMs, but to be honest, these things do not fit in my ears, which is also similar to some KZs, even though it's a different shell. I confirmed it is a different shell than the KZs that don't fit my ear. It's got just like this pretty aggressive design that frankly does not fit in my ear. So unfortunately did not have a great time here with the QKZ Cross HBB, but again, if you're looking for a lot of bass, that still might be your pick. But let's talk now about the Moondrop Quarks DSP. Honestly, the sound thing that stands out the most here about the Quarks DSP is that it just sounds a little bit low resolution, if I'm pretty honest, but it is pretty easy and smooth. And the tuning on this it's actually pretty good. I mean, it's basically on Harman neutral, which just gives you a nice open mid-range. It's clean. It doesn't have any at all sense of stridency in the treble, whereas a lot of these others do have either some sharpness or just uncomfort. The treble on this is nice and smooth, but it's just also not very well extended. It rolls off quite a bit, and I think that is what contributes a lot to the low resolution sound here on the Quarks DSP. And I think kind of related to that, there's just not a lot of sense of separation and space in the sound here. It sounds, it definitely doesn't sound mono, like literally mono, but of the bunch on the table here, it probably sounds the most mono. I don't know. The treble roll off on this is unfortunate, given how good the tuning is with the mid-range otherwise. With my test track Break for Lovers, I felt like the bass attacks, they actually sounded a little bit rounded, like they didn't have quite the definition and incisiveness on them. And the vocals were, they lack a bit of texture. Again, this is just kind of all coming from this somewhat of a low resolution sound. With Graffiti, my Sibilance test track, Sibilance is very, very well controlled on the Quarks, and I think I attribute that to the very smooth treble. But unfortunately, there was just really no texture through the vocal. So to be honest, I would say I don't love either of these IEMs a ton, but we do have to pick a winner. And in terms of, let's see, tonal balance, to be honest, I'll take the Harman neutral versus the, in my opinion, overly bassy QKZ. Technical performance, honestly, they're about on par. Like I'm going to give them both a point, even though they're both like, maybe don't get a point. The QKZ, I think it's kind of woofy in the bass. A little bit soft, but I don't know. It's got decently extended treble on paper, at least. The Quarks is pretty low resolution. It's at least nice and clean sounding, but most of that's going to come from the tonal. And in terms of physical stuff, to be honest, I would probably take the Quarks, even though the Quarks does not have a removable cable. And that is one of the differences here. This one does have a removable cable, even though it's a nice stock cable. This one's not removable. The stock cable is actually pretty decent on this, and in fact, it's got a remote control because it's got the USB connector and does not have a 3.5 millimeter connector. But I do think overall, because it actually fits me, I think the Quarks DSP is going to take the win in terms of form factor. So overall, Quarks DSP takes the win, and that one's going to move on in the winner's bracket, and the QKZ is going to head down here to the loser's bracket. And now finally, in round two, to round out our round two, we're going to go back to the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero versus, this is a bit of a spicy matchup versus the the Moondrop Chu. I already said 7 Hz. You don't need to hear me say that again. Okay. Frankly, I didn't remember that this comparison was happening this soon. But yeah, let's talk about the Moondrop Chu. So again, this is one of the more hyped sets that came out at the beginning of the year. Tonally, I think this set is actually really pretty stinking good. It's maybe a little bit bright, a little bit thin, a little bit bass light, especially in comparison to some of the other sets on here. But it sounds tonally correct. Like vocals sound really quite good on here. The lower treble, I would say it just comes across the line in terms of emphasis into a little bit on the irritating side. It's not uncomfortable. It just comes across maybe a little bit distracting would be kind of my main quibble with the tonal balance here on the Chu. But the technical performance is actually pretty good. You get a nice sense of imaging. It's maybe a little bit shallow in terms of its head stage, because it doesn't have a ton of bass depth to it. But to be honest, like the left to right imaging is actually pretty good and the separation is quite good. On my test track, Break for Lovers, I found that the vocals on the Chu, they sound great. You also get a pretty decent sense of bass attack. Again, it's not a bassy set, but what bass is there is well tuned and it is well defined in its attack. And that treble ch-ch-ch that's at the beginning of that same track, Break for Lovers, that's where it being a little bit irritating kind of comes across. You can really hear it. Just sounds, it's more, again, it's more of a distracting emphasis than it is so much of an uncomfortable emphasis, at least for me. And then on the track Games of Luck by the Parcels, I thought that the hi-hats actually sound surprisingly good for their timbre. Although, again, there's just not a lot of weight to the sound and not a ton of depth to the sound because of the bass. Physical form factor stuff we'll talk about here on the Chu. These are all metal shells, which are nice. They're nice and small, and I actually really like the way these things fit. And they come with spring tips, which you know I am a simp for. The one quibble, and this is a big quibble I will make of the build and the form factor here on the Chu, is this stock cable, which I don't even want to unwind right now because the fact that I've got it in 1 wad right now is somewhat of a miracle. This cable is a pain in the D, and I don't want to unwind it for that fact. So yeah, there you go. Let's head back over here to the chart and start tallying these up. And to be honest, this one's gonna be kind of tough. I think in terms of tonal balance, honestly, I'm gonna give the win to the Salnotes Zero. I think they do a lot of things similar. Like they're both kind of a more mid-range focused sound, more mid-rangey than some of the other ones. A little bit more vocal focus with a mild bass boost. I think the bass boost on the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero is a little bit more emphasized, a little bit better rounded, and then the treble, the lower treble on the Zero doesn't have the issue that we have with the Chu. So while the Chu is actually quite good in terms of tonal balance, I'm going to give the win to the Salnotes Zero. In terms of technical performance, honestly, I would say they're probably about on par. Like they both have a good sense of depth and a pretty good sense of imaging. Maybe the Zero takes the edge in terms of micro contrast and detail, but it's splitting hairs a little bit. And then in terms of form factor, look, I don't love the way this one looks, and I hate the cable on this thing, but this thing fits fine, and I can replace the cable. So the winner is going to be the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero. It's going to take 3 points. And even if we weren't just talking about the physical stuff, like just in terms of pure sound, I think that the 7 Hz does the sound of the Chu, a very, very similar sound to the Chu, but it does it better. And because of that, the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero is going to move on in the winner's bracket. And the Chu is going to, unfortunately, head out to the loser's bracket. All right, so I think at this point, we've now gone through, I think all of the IEMs have kind of had a time on the main stage. They've all either won or gotten knocked into a loser's bracket. So the rest of these comparisons should go a little bit quicker, but no promises. So let's just head down to the loser's bracket, and we're gonna start marking some losers. All right, now. Whoever loses a match here is out of the tournament. I'll give it a final score, but that's going to be it. And let's start here, all right? Let's start with the Moondrop Chu versus the Tanchjim Zero, all right? Moondrop Chu versus Tanchjim Zero. In terms of tonal balance, I think it's really not very close. The Chu is better. The Tanchjim Zero is just a little bit skewed, a little bit too bright, a little bit SSR-like in a way, but unfortunately the Zero doesn't have the technical performance of the SSR. In fact, the Moondrop Chu, I would say, beats it in terms of technical performance as well. The one area where I would say that the Tanchjim is a little bit better is I do like the form factor on this, even though they are cheaper plastic shells. And fit actually is probably not quite as good for me on the Chu. The cable on this is actually just really pretty good. So I think form factor, I will give the win to the Tanchjim Zero, but overall the winner is going to be the Moondrop Chu. So the Moondrop Chu stays in the tournament. It moves on in the loser's bracket, and unfortunately the Tanchjim Zero is gonna leave us now, and I will give it a rating to bid it farewell. You know, I didn't give this one a review earlier this year, but the Tanchjim Zero, this is not a bad set. It's got nice base attack, decent form factor, but it's not quite there. So I'm going to give it 3 stars out of 5. But back to our tournament. Let's go back here. What else is up in our losers bracket? So we've got the Tangzu Wan'er versus the Tanchjim Ola. Let me pull those things into view and talk about how they compare. All right. Let's see. In terms of tonal balance, honestly, I'd probably give the win to the Ola. It's just a little bit more mid-range focused, and I guess because of that, I'll take it. In terms of, yeah, and the Tangzu is just a little bit, I don't know, it's a little bit V-shaped for my tastes, and the vocals do end up getting a little bit more pulled back in the mix because of the emphasis on the bass and the treble on this set. In terms of technical performance, I think the Tangzu Wan'er is probably going to take that one. And then in terms of form factor, well, the Tangzu Wan'er actually fits my ear, so I'll give it a win there too. And I think overall, I don't love either of these sets, but I will give the win to the Tangzu Wan'er, which means that the Tangzu Wan'er is going to continue on in our losers bracket. And the Tanchjim Ola, unfortunately, is going to leave us. I already did do a review of this one, but I will just reiterate it for posterity's sake. This is a 3 out of 5. It's a decent little set. It's kind of inoffensive, except it just doesn't fit that well, and the bass is really pretty lackluster, unfortunately. So let's head back to our bracket, and we could continue on with some winners bracket. You know what? Let's go back to the winners bracket. We'll fill out the rest of this losers bracket, and then we'll power through the losers bracket and save our final winners head-to-head matchup for the end. Let's talk about the Tin Hi-Fi C2 versus the Kiwi Ears Cadenza, and I'm looking around my table to try and find them. C2 versus Kiwi Ears Cadenza. All right. Recall what I said about these earlier. The Tin Hi-Fi C2, all right, in terms of tonal balance, honestly, they're both pretty good. The Kiwi Ears Cadenza is maybe a little bit more mid-range focused, and I like that, but I do find that the treble rolls off a little bit on it. And that can give it a little bit of a dead sound in a way is that the Tin C2 is just honestly pretty consistently kind of outstanding. It's a little bit contrasty, a little bit more contrasty than the Kiwi Ears Cadenza, but I will take that extended treble. And then in terms of technical performance, honestly, that extended treble, and I think contributes to a better sense of bass. It contributes to a better sense of depth. And it just overall sounds like just a more mature sounding earphone. The Kiwi Ears Cadenza is no slouch in this regard, but honestly, up against the C2, it's pretty surprising how good the C2 is. So I know the Kiwi Ears Cadenza probably has a little bit more hype going into the end of the year, but my honest take is that just purely on sound, I think the C2 wins both in terms of tech and tone. Now, in terms of form factor, this one's honestly a little bit of a toss-up because I do love the metal build of the C2, and the fit is also pretty good on here. The Kiwi Ears, I like the aesthetic on this, and the fit is maybe a little bit better for me on the Cadenza. But I guess I'll give them both a point in terms of the form factor, but that is going to leave the Tin Hi-Fi C2 as our winner in this matchup. So that one's going to advance in the winner's bracket. Cadenza is going to go down in the loser's bracket. But before we get to how the Cadenza fares, let's pick up the Moondrop Quarks DSP versus the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero. I'm going to move those things into view. All right, let's talk about this comparison for a second here. In terms of tonal balance, this is actually an interesting comparison because the Quarks is using DSP to achieve its tuning, and it achieves a tuning that you can't really get in a single dynamic driver set, certainly not for $15 without the use of DSP. It's Harman neutral, a little bit thin in the mid-range, but it's got some bass emphasis to it and a generally rolled off smooth treble. Whereas the 7 Hz, I would say, it's maybe a little bit brighter in terms of its tonal balance, a little bit less bassy, but overall, to be honest, I prefer it. So I'm going to give the tonal balance win to the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero. In terms of technical performance, this one's actually pretty easy. 7 Hz Salnotes Zero is just a much better technical performer. I think because of that extended treble, it contributes to a lot of the frequency, or just a lot of the sound across the frequency response. So vocals have a lot more texture on the Salnotes Zero. I think even like the bass attack sounds a little bit tighter, and I attribute that somewhat to the treble performance. So I'll give that. And then in terms of form factor, I mean, The Zero does have a removable cable, but I think it looks goofy. It does fit pretty well, but form factor, I think I will honestly probably still give the win to the Quarks DSP. I like the form on that set, but it's not going to be enough to take this win. I think it just sounds a little bit too low resolution on the Quarks DSP. It's just, in terms of tonal balance, I think a preference for sure for the Zero. I don't want to say a slight preference, but it's a preference. Where it comes to technical performance, however, it is a big preference for the 7 Hz Zero. And so that's going to advance in the winners bracket. And that's leaving, as you can see here in the winners bracket, we've got just the Tin Hi-Fi C2 and the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero. The winner of this matchup is going to be our winner of KONCHA KOMBAT, but we gotta fill out the rest of the rankings first. So let's dive back down here to the losers bracket and start powering through to pick out some other favorites. So let's talk about the QKZ Cross HBB. Where is this? Versus the Moondrop Chu. Okay, so we're gonna do this little comparison. That's what's next up in our bracket. In terms of tonal balance, for my preference, honestly, it's not too close. I much prefer the Chu. It's definitely gonna be the less bassy of the set. So again, if you want more bass, the QKZ Cross HBB is definitely gonna be the one for you. But I prefer the balance on the Chu. Just does vocal performance much better. I think also in terms of technical performance, the Chu is better sense of imaging and separation and layering in the sound. Again, the bass on the HBB, there's a lot there, but I found it to be kind of woofy and low resolution. And then in terms of form factor, well, this one's tough actually, because I hate this cable, but these things just don't really fit me very well. If I'm honest, the one that I would probably rather put in my ears is actually going to be the Moondrop Chu. So I think that's going to be kind of a clean sweep for the Chu. And unfortunately, that's going to knock out the QKZ Cross HBB. The Moondrop Chu does still exist in our tournament. It moves on in the losers bracket. But that does mean that the QKZ Cross HBB is exiting our bracket. I'm going to give it a score. Unfortunately, I don't like this set that much. It's pretty woofy bass. If you, again, you want a lot of bass, there is a lot of bass here. $20, it's pretty cheap, but it doesn't really fit my ears. I think the bass is not very great. And the treble performance is also a little bit low res sounding. So 2 stars for the QKZ Cross HBB. Good showing. Thank you for showing up, but we're going to move on in our bracket tournament. Also, let's see, what else can we clean up? You can see that setting up the Moondrop Chu versus the Kiwi Ears Cadenza, but we'll get to that in a bit. And we're going to start here instead with the Tripowin Lea versus the Tangzu Wan'er. Okay, let's go here. Ooh, this one's actually tough. I don't know if I thought this one through too much. In terms of tonal balance, honestly, I think I'll probably take the Tripowin Lea. I think it's a little bit bright up top, but it's just an overall more balanced tune. In terms of technical performance, the Lea does sound a little bit low resolution. The Tangzu does have like that nice satisfying bass attack, but I found the bass to otherwise sound a little bit plasticky, and I really don't like the treble on the Tangzu Wan'er. So while there is a little bit of grit and grain to the treble and it's kind of low resolution on the Lea, I did honestly find it more satisfying to listen to. And then in terms of the form factor stuff, I think the Tangzu is by far the more attractive of the bunch. The Lea is just that's kind of an awful looking IEM. I'm sorry. It is a nice metal shell, and this actually fits me pretty well. The Wan'er fits me okay. I don't know. I think I'll probably give them both a win or both a point in the build category. They're about on par. I maybe slightly prefer the Lea, but that one's pretty close. But in terms of sound, I think I'll take the Lea. And so while we've got another somewhat of a hyped IEM here in the Tangzu Wan'er, it's unfortunately going to leave our bracket tournament at this moment, and we'll bid it farewell. Out of 5 stars, I'll give the Wan'er 3 stars. Look, this is not an awful set, not even necessarily a bad set. It sounds like a $20 set. It sounds like roughly what I would expect at this price range. Build quality, I would say, is also roughly what I would expect at this price range. The frequency response looks really good. I kind of went into it with high expectations, and maybe I went into it with too high expectations, but unfortunately, I don't really love this set that much. Maybe, again, if you want a lot of bass, there is more bass emphasis there than there are on some of the other ones. But That's just, that's how I sees them. So we're going to go back down here to our losers bracket. We can see how this thing is filling out. Let's bring back in actually the Tripowin Lea, since we've already got it here on the table, and we'll bring it in versus the Moondrop Quarks. Okay. Let's see. In terms of tonal balance, ooh, I think I'm going to have to give the win to the Quarks DSP. I mean, it's harmon neutral, which isn't my favorite tune, but it is just a cleaner mid-range. Again, the Lea can come across a little bit overly bright, which can be a little irritating in a way that the Quarks just isn't. In terms of technical performance, honestly, I'll probably give the point to the Lea because it doesn't, while it does still sound kind of low resolution, it doesn't sound as low resolution as the DSP. The Quarks DSP really just, its treble is quite rolled off, and it gives it this pleasant, unoffensive sound with a nice mid-range presentation, but it's also just lacks excitement in a lot of ways. And then in terms of form factor, I think, that one's actually kind of tough. I do have to pick a winner here because I can't punk out on this one. I got to pick a winner. Honestly, I'd probably pick the Moondrop Quarks. I like the cable on this. While it is built in, you can't take it off. It's a nice soft cable. It doesn't hold its memory. This one does hold its memory a little bit. And I like this little, there's not a lot of bullet IEMs out there in the world, and I like to see them every once in a while. So I think I will advance the Moondrop Quarks DSP in the losers bracket, and that's going to mean that the Tripowin Lea is unfortunately leaving us here in this tournament. A nice frequency response, maybe a little bit bright, and unfortunately the treble just kind of undermines the set. It's not irritating, uncomfortable treble, it's just a little bit distracting, kind of in a similar way to the Chu, but I think this comes across a little bit more low resolution than the Chu. So out of 5 stars, I'm gonna give the Tripowin Lea 3 stars out of 5. All right, moving on in our bracket tournament, let's go to the Kiwi Ears Cadenza versus the Moondrop Chu. We got Cadenza and we've got Chu. And this is a pretty tough competition, to be honest, except for that cable. Good God, that cable is stinking awful. But all right, how do these things stack up? In terms of tonal balance, I think I'm actually going to take the Chu personally. This one is a bit of a toss-up. If you want more bass in your tune, the Cadenza, I think it does a bassier tune quite well and still preserves like a nice mid-range focus. But overall, I do think I like the Chu a little bit better. In terms of technical performance, honestly, I think the Chu's actually a little bit better. I think the treble is just better extended, doesn't roll off as much, so I get a better sense of imaging, a better sense of head stage. It's maybe a little bit flatter because of the bass on the Chu being a little bit lackluster. But the Kiwi Ears Cadenza, it does have a nice sense of depth to the bass and a decent sense of micro contrast to the mid-range, but I do think that the Chu does that better. And then in terms of form factor, I'll be honest, this is not close. The Kiwi Ears is just a much better form. Not only do these shells look really nice and fit in my ears well, they also are not attached to the world's most awful cable. So I will give that point to the Cadenza. But if I'm honest, I think I would take the Moondrop Chu just purely in terms of sound. I don't know that the sound is better enough that I would actually take it over the Cadenza because of that cable. But in terms of how it does in KONCHA KOMBAT, the Moondrop Chu is actually going to be the one that advances. And that's going to lead me here to talk about the Kiwi Ears Cadenza. Unfortunately, as it exits our tournament, I think, a nice frequency response. It's definitely got some bass emphasis to it. So if you're looking for a bassy set, of the sets that are more bassy, I think this is the best of the bunch. Unfortunately, you might have noticed there's one bassy set still left in the tournament, but most of the other ones have kind of been knocked out. And I do think the bass is pretty good on this set. Treble's just unfortunately a little bit roll off, and that contributes to just somewhat weak technical performance. It's not bad, it's not irritating. This is a nice, easy listen in a lot of ways, and I love the form factor. The build in this set is actually really good. For 35 bucks, not too shabby. Honestly, the Kiwi Ears Cadenza, I think I'm gonna give it a solid 4 stars out of 5, and you can see as we're getting further on in this tournament, even the ones that are getting knocked out are still pretty good. And unfortunately for the Cadenza, that's where it's at. So let's go back to our bracket tournament. And again, we're gonna leave this winner's bracket alone for a little bit, and we're gonna stick here Oh my goodness, I don't think I did this on purpose, but we've got the Moondrop Chu versus the Moondrop Quarks. Two Moondrop IEMs have finally made their way to battle each other, I suppose, here in this tournament. Interesting. Okay, this is going to be all right. Tonal balance. Moondrop Chu versus the Quarks. Honestly, I like the Chu better. It's, again, that lower treble emphasis is a little bit irritating, or a little bit more just distracting than it is irritating or uncomfortable. But I like the brighter. It's a little bit more contrasty, and I think better treble extension is going to contribute a lot to that. So I do think that the Chu takes the tonal balance there, even though the Quarks does have the strength of DSP behind it. Just the treble roll off especially spoils the tonal balance a little bit for me. And then very much significantly spoils the technical performance. I think the Moondrop Chu takes that as well. In terms of form factor, it's no question I'll take the Quarks DSP, even though it's got all plastic shells versus the nice metal shells here on the Chu. And again, these things fit beautifully, but are unfortunately attached to the world's most awful cable, whereas the cable here on the Quarks DSP is quite nice. So I will give that a win in the form factor department, but unfortunately here in KONCHA KOMBAT, that is not enough. And so I think the Moondrop Chu is going to advance in our losers bracket, and the Quarks DSP will exit. Out of 5 stars, it's pretty cheap. It's $15. It fits nice, but I don't know. I still think that's probably like a 3-star IEM. Just the technical performance on this is just quite flat. Doesn't inspire a lot of interest for me. It's not a bad set. If you're looking for something that needs a USB-C connector versus a 3.5 millimeter, you don't want to use a dongle on your phone. Well, Quarks is not a bad set. Again, very inoffensive, but it's also just kind of unengaging, unfortunately, in a lot of ways. So Quarks DSP has exited the tournament, and that's going to leave us here with our winners bracket. And to be honest, all right, let's see. I'll pull these things into view. This is the Tin Hi-Fi C2 versus the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero. And the winner of this is going to win the tournament, basically, right? There is a chance in a double elimination tournament for the winner of the losers bracket to come out and win the tournament overall. But well, it's not going to happen here. Well, we'll see. All right, let's talk about how these two IEMs compare. And it makes sense that these are the two in the winners finals, okay? It makes all the sense in the world. Let's go back to our screen and talk about how they stack up. To be honest, this is pretty tough. I think in terms of tonal balance, purely on tuning, personally for my preferences, I'm gonna pick the 7 Hz Salnotes Zero. It's a little bit brighter, a little bit more mid-range focus, and a little bit less bassy. A little bit less contrasty, maybe more to the point. Whereas the Tin Hi-Fi C2 is a mild V-shaped sound signature. It's a little bit more contrasty. And to be honest, I don't hate it at all. I think the tuning on the C2 is actually surprisingly fantastic. It's just not as mid-range focused as my preference, which would be the Zero. In terms of technical performance, however, I think the C2 wins pretty handily. I mean, the technical performance on the 7 Hz Zero is no slouch. It's got a good sense of micro contrast and a decent sense of imaging, but there's not a ton of depth, probably because of the somewhat lackluster bass on the Zero, whereas the bass on the C2, I think is a lot more satisfying. Not only is there more bass to it, but I think it also it hits a little bit more satisfying, and especially just kind of digs deep, and it gives really a better sense of that kind of like front to back head stage depth that makes this really satisfying. And I also think that both of them do a really good job with treble extension, but I do think that the C2 is kind of next level in the budget space in that area. And then in terms of form factor, well, this one looks pretty good. This one looks kind of awful. They both have removable cables. This one's a metal shell, that one's a plastic shell. This one does cost more, $30 versus like $23. So take it for what it is, but to be honest, I'm going to give the form factor win to the Tin Hi-Fi C2. So this is a pretty close battle. I know that the form factor is what just gave the C2 the win, but honestly, if I was even just picking them based purely on sound, even though I slightly prefer the tonal balance of the Zero. I think the technical performance of the C2 really is just that much better, that just purely on sound, I would actually take the C2 over the 7Hz Zero. And so the C2 is going to advance to grand finals. There's a chance that the winner of the losers bracket will knock it out, but I don't know. We'll see about that. So let's go down finally to our losers final matchup, which is going to be the 7Hz Zero versus the Moondrop Chu. And I think we already actually did this battle, didn't we? Tonal balance wise, I think the 7Hz Zero is better. Technical performance, I think they're both pretty good. And then form factor, well, the Zero doesn't have an awful cable, so the 7Hz Zero is going to win that matchup, which puts it, well, okay, Moondrop Chu, unfortunately, now is exiting our tournament. If this cable wasn't so awful, I would have higher frequency of recommending the set, but it's still quite good. So Moondrop Chu, still 4 stars out of 5. That's what I gave it earlier this year. I still agree with it, even in the context of all these others. But going back here to the table, this is our final head-to-head. We just did it. No surprise, unfortunately, the 7Hz is exiting our tournament. It has just been eliminated by the Tin Hi-Fi C2. A very, very good set. The tonal balance on this, I think, is probably my favorite of the bunch. Most mid-range focus, a little bit bright, but a decent sense of bass depth to it, and just a really good sense of texture to the mid-range. I think out of 5 stars, honestly, the biggest thing holding this back for me is going to be the form factor stuff. It looks goofy, obviously, in this colorway. You can get it in less goofy looking colorways. Fit's actually not too bad, but I still don't really love the form factor on it. So out of 5 stars, I'm going to give this 4 out of 5. I personally would take this over the Chu, but that is going to leave our KONCHA KOMBAT winner as, let me go out here, the Tin Hi-Fi C2. Honestly, this was the IEM that kind of inspired this whole tournament, because Tin Hi-Fi sent me 3 different IEMs, the C2, the C3, the T4 Plus. I measured them, and I started listening to this while I was measuring the others, and I was really just like, what's going on? I feel like this sounds much better than it should. And I saw the graphs of the other ones that look very similar. I was like, okay, those must be better, but this one actually sounded better. I was like, okay, wait, how good is this really? And so I started listening to some of my other budget stuff that I had in-house, and I was like, okay, there's a bunch of other stuff getting hyped up. Is this thing really as good as I think it is? And to be honest, after the past couple of weeks listening to this, comparing it with these other budget IEMs, yes, I think the Tin Hi-Fi C2 is not just a very good sounding IEM. I think this is the best budget set of 2022. And that's after extensive testing, and you just saw a very thorough bracket style tournament, double elimination. I don't know, congrats to the Moondrop, the Tin Hi-Fi C2. Out of 5 stars, to be honest, this is my first 5-star budget set in a long time. I think the C2 is pretty outstanding. I can't think of any reason to not recommend this set. The cable is fine, but it's also replaceable if you want to get a different cable. And then the build on this is actually pretty nice for a $30 IEM. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to do it for this round of KONCHA KOMBAT. If you're interested in checking out any of the IEMs that we talked about, I've got links to all of them in the description. Down below, I've also got a link to Squig Link, where you can compare the frequency responses of them if you are so inclined. And if you're here live, well, stick around. We'll have a bit of a live chat, but let me take a little quick break real quick. I'll catch up on some tea, and then I'll be here to answer all of your burning questions. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next super review. Cheers.